Talk to this audience.
All right, let's get the test version of this audience. Hi.
Hi.
Hello everyone, great to be here in Orlando. I can't wait to meet Figment. And this seems like a pretty cool group, too.
I don't know, you guys think you're a pretty cool group? Yes. Yeah, okay. We'll see about that. So I want to talk a little bit about building actions for the Google Assistant, what sorts of things you can do, and how you do them. Hey Google, advance.
I'm Alan's assistant, and this is a very old picture of Alan. He's the one in the gray shirt.
Just in case you couldn't tell because of the hair. My name's Alan Firstenberg. I am a software developer and consultant for a company called Objective Consulting. I am also what Google refers to as a Google developer expert. And that means a lot of what I do is kind of act as a liaison between you and Google in both directions. So I help you understand what Google is doing with their technologies and how to incorporate it into what you are doing. And at the same time, I take the feedback and input from you and help Google understand what you need, how to do your job better, how to bring better things to your clients, and how to bring better things to the world. This is going to be one of the two slides that's important to take a picture of because the URLs are at the bottom. Two of the URLs are for my company and my personal one. So spiders.com is where I work. Prisoner.com is my personal website. That's where you'll be able to find all of my contact information later, as well as these slides. And in particular, these slides will be under the bottom URL at prisoner.com/ubi for ubiquitous computing. Hey Google, advance.
And who are all of you wonderful people in the audience?
So let me learn a few things about you really quick. How many of you are mobile developers out there? A couple of you. Okay. How about web developers? A few of you. I saw a bunch of you not raise your hands. So what do you guys consider yourselves? Full stack developers, server developers? Assistant developer up front, what? Embedded. Embedded, ooh, okay. How many of you have heard of the Amazon Echo and Alexa? A few of you, just a couple. How many of you have heard of the Google Assistant? Same number, good. How many of you own an Alexa device? Sorry to see that. How many of you own a Google Home? Roughly the same people. Interesting, but good to see. How many of you like the Google Home more than Alexa? A couple of you. The other way? Okay. How many of you are Mac developers? Windows developers? Linux? Something else? How many of you program in JavaScript? Good number of you. How about Java? A few of you as well. Something else? PHP? Python? Okay, Python I can deal with. PHP? Good. Excellent to see. I like this crowd a lot. What are you programming for your embedded stuff? C? Okay. Go. Okay, interesting. How many of you here are students? A couple of students in the crowd. Okay, good. Now for some important questions.
This audience isn't responding right now.
Oh, we're going to
Try
have problems, I
again
can tell. Now for the important questions. Parks. Which of you like the Magic Kingdom the most? Epcot? Epcot, all right. Hollywood Studios? Animal Kingdom? Okay. Hey Google, advance.
Now that we know about all of you, let's briefly talk about why we're all here.
Well, we know why we're here. We're here because voice is cool, right? Everyone agreeing with this? Raising your hand. I see a bunch of heads nodding, a couple of hands up. Excellent. Well, here's the thing. Voice is cool, but we're here for more than that. Voice is a fundamentally different way that we have to communicate with our technologies than we have used for the previous 5 or 6 decades when it comes to computing. We use voice to communicate and to do things with our technology more in passing. So in the same way that we'll enter a room and just flick on a light switch without thinking about it, increasingly we're able to use voice to do things without having to think too much about it. We can want to do it and then find that it is done. That is the power of voice, and that's what I want to talk to you about today, is how we can take that natural thing, the thing that we are all very, very used to, very, very practiced with. We all communicate. We all talk. How can we leverage our knowledge of that and bring it into the technology world? Hey, Google, advance.
Enough about you. Let's talk about me. What is my role in all this?
So Google defines the Google Assistant as a conversation between you and Google that helps you get things done in your world. And there are two parts of this that I find really, really important, and I've highlighted them here. The first is that this is a conversation. So unlike seeing a screen where we have to click on certain things and then things happen, this is a conversation. And in some conversations, there's a back and forth. Some conversations are very short conversations. You ask someone to do something, and it's done. But the assistant is defining bigger, broader conversations. The second thing, and this is really crucial to understand, the assistant is doing things in your world. You are not asked to learn how to do something the way the machine is asking you to do it. So for the past bunch of decades, we've all had to relearn how to do things because that's what the machine is making us do. Google is turning this around. Google is saying, instead of having to learn arcane commands, instead of having to learn keyboard controls, instead of having to learn what icons to click on, instead of having to learn finger gestures, Google will learn how you ask for things. And that's a very radical shift that I want you to keep in mind. Hey, Google, advance.
And what do you developers do?
We develop what are called actions on Google. And I like to define actions on Google as the API that let you engage in conversations, or let your users engage in conversations, with other services through the Google Assistant. Three things here that I want to emphasize. The first is that actions on Google is an API. Anyone not know what an API is? Of course, we're developers. We know what an API is. This is something familiar to us already. The second, again, we're engaging in conversations. So instead of having to present that screen for people to click on, instead of having to come up with instructions or commands, we're now engaging in conversations. And then finally, actions on Google is how people are going to communicate with our services. What sorts of services? We'll look at that in a second. But this is how users will use the Google Assistant to communicate with everything else. These conversations that we build, they need to be built in any of a number of ways. We're going to look at one way called dialog flow. And then the code that we write for them needs to live in the cloud. So the way a conversation normally will work is the user will say something to the assistant over on your left. There we go, left. It hands it off to Dialogflow, which will turn it into something that's a little more understandable to us. We then process it in the cloud, and things go back in the reverse. Hey, Google, advance.
Okay, so how do you build an action? And how do you make it awesome?
Well, like everything that we build in software, there are three important components to it: design, develop, and deploy it. I'll be talking mostly about the first two today. When we talk about designing it, we talk about coming up with a personality for our conversation, for our conversational agent, and then coming up with the scripts that are associated with it. What does the conversation look like? What does it sound like? What do we expect the user to say? How are we going to reply? We're then going to develop it. We will turn each component of these scripts into what we refer to as an intent. What did the user intend when they said this? And what is our reply going to be to that? We were then going to write the code to handle it. And this code, since it's going to live in the cloud, all it needs to do is handle an HTTP request. We're going to send back an HTTP reply. We call this a webhook. And then finally, we need to do some testing because, we're good coders, so we'll put that off to the last minute anyway. Then finally, when we deploy it, We need to deploy it somewhere on the cloud. We have good tools at hand like that, like Cloud Functions and Firebase. And then we need to hook up analytics of some sort to that. And again, I'm not going to be talking too much about those parts. Hey, Google, advance.
Maybe this is a silly question, but what can the actions you write do?
Whatever we want. We're developers. That's what's so awesome about being a developer, right? We can make computers do whatever we want them to do. And the assistant helps us do that. So the biggest key point to remember, though, in doing this is that it needs to reflect and sound like and act like a conversation. So while there are lots of things that we can do, the things that work best are things where there is some back and forth, or where I'm issuing a command, or where I'm asking a question and expecting a response back. Pretty much everything that we do with the assistant is in the form of the human says or does something, the machine answers. The human may respond to that or react to that. The machine will respond to that. This back and forth type of conversation model. But we can do things like query databases based on what the user is asking for. Query spreadsheets based on what the user is asking for. Doesn't matter. If we can get the data out, we can reflect it in a conversation. Maybe we want to collect that information from a user and store it in a database. We can do that. With some permission from the user, we can ask for some very specific pieces of information. For example, where they are at that moment. So we can get their location, get their name, get account information. All of that can be done, but it requires the user's explicit permission to do so. And then, of course, what most people have done are fun things like quizzes and personality tests and role-playing games and quotes and so forth and so on. But I want to make sure you guys think about and understand, if you're already doing something and you can turn it into a conversation.
This audience isn't responding right now. Try again soon.
You can do it with the assistant. And if you want afterwards, I'll explain why it's doing this. Hey, Google. Hey, Google, advance.
Once we know what we want the action to do, we figure out how that code works and then prompt for the information?
No. That's actually exactly what we don't want it to do. What we want it to do is we want to figure out the personality. This is kind of like the look and feel of a website. So first we want to figure out the personality, then script what we expect the user to say, and come up with responses that fit that personality, and then figure out the code. One of the biggest problems we see a lot of people doing is they invert this. They try to write the code, and then they try to shoehorn a conversation over it. And what we find are those conversations look and feel very stilted. They feel like you're talking to a machine, and that the machine is responding. Whereas if you turn it around and write scripts first, write out as if you were acting the part, as if you had two people standing there that were talking to each other, and write that down. Write down all the different ways that conversation can go. If you do that, and then build your code to it, it feels more natural, and it works a lot better. Hey, Google, advance.
What do you mean by a personality? Why should we care?
Personalities are like the look and feel of a website, or the look and feel of an app. So a lot of people kind of poo-poo and discard this notion, well, why do I care what it's going to, what personality it has? Does it even make sense for a computer to have a personality? It does, and it's important for you to think about. Because if you don't come up with that personality, if you don't define the way that your action needs to sound, then your audience is going to come up with one for you, and you're almost guaranteed not to be the one that you want. So if you are a bank, and you're trying to write a voice action, and you want that voice action to sound professional, courteous, but professional, you're going to come up with one set of conversations. Whereas if you're something that is supposed to be more lighthearted, if it's more of a game show, you want that to be light and airy and fluffy. You don't want the game show to be very stuffy, because that sounds wrong. It feels wrong. And if you think of that in terms of, if you were writing a bank's website and you were filling it with cartoon characters, you're going to wonder, is the person really going to want to interact with that bank? Probably not. Again, I want to point out, if you don't make the personality, if you don't set the tone for the conversation, your users will, and it's probably not going to be what you want. Hey, Google, advance.
Now that we have a conversation, what do we do with this script?
So we take this script and we put it into what we call a natural language understanding or a natural language processing system. Dialogflow is one of those kinds of systems. And what it does is it helps take a bunch of sample phrases, things that you're expecting the user to say, and turn them into a single entity that we call an intent. So here, for example, if we had asked the user what their favorite color is, they might say, well, my favorite color is red. Or they might just simply answer, red. Both of those are expressing the same thing, what their favorite color is. We're condensing it down to a single entity, an intent that we're calling favorite color. Furthermore, we're capturing a particular parameter from that. Again, we're programmers, we know what parameters are. And in this case, the parameter is a color. So we have an intent, broadly speaking, what they're transmitting to us, and we have a parameter. One of the things I want you to make sure you remember, intents capture what the user is saying. It's not capturing what you're going to do with it. I can do any number of things once I have their color. I can respond to them in any one of a number of ways. But an intent captures what they said, what they are intending for you to learn. Hey, Google, advance.
When do we actually get to write some code?
Well, our code is what does something. It does whatever we want it to do. And now that we've defined the conversation, now that we've been able to break that conversation down into important bits called intents, those intents and the parameters can get handed to us in our code. Code lives in the cloud. It can run in any language whatsoever, as long as you can run it on a server somewhere that Google can access. And as long as you can read the JSON that Google is going to hand to you, and as long as you can hand JSON back in the format that it expects, you can use whatever language you want. I'm going to be demonstrating with JavaScript with Node.js here. And here is where we handle that intent. So the intent that I just showed you about person expressing their favorite color, here's a few lines of code that just basically says, okay, we're going to capture the intent of what their favorite color is, and we're going to reply back to them saying, that's my favorite color too. What would you like to do now? So we respond about what they've said, and then we move the conversation forward. We don't just leave them hanging. Very simple, straightforward replies. Again, you can do this sort of thing in any language, though. Hey, Google, advance.
That looks pretty simple. That's all you need to do?
Well, if that's all you want to do, then yeah, that's all you need to do. Sometimes you don't need complicated replies. Most of the time, if you actually want to do something, however, you do need a complicated reply. So we'll probably want to have a lot of intents to capture a lot of different things that the user is expressing to us. We're going to have many different intent handlers. So each of these functions we refer to as an intent handler to do different things with them. So what we have here is a different handler handling the exact same thing. And instead of just replying, what we're saying is we're making a call out to an API, getting some information about that color, and telling the user about it. Somebody in this morning session asked, is there a way to send it out to someplace else in the cloud? There is. You call an API. We're developers, we know how to do this sort of thing. The biggest catch here, certainly when using JavaScript, is that you need to make sure that the API returns before your function returns. And the way we do that in JavaScript is we use what's called a promise. As part of that, we need to return a promise back to the library so that it knows that we're still waiting for something. And that when the promise completes, we come up with an answer, and everything can get sent back out, and we're all good. About 50% of the developers that go down this road get lost at this point. And it's really a pretty straightforward point. If you're doing an asynchronous call, you need to do it inside a promise. You need to return that promise. If you remember that, you're good.
This audience isn't responding
So
right
close.
now. Try again soon.
Hey, Google, advance.
What about APIs that require the user's permission?
Now, this sort of thing requires a little more work on our part. So if you wanted to do something like access a user's Google Drive or a file in their Google Drive, or access their calendar, we need to be able to get permission from them to do that kind of access. And we need to do that in 2 steps right now because of the way authentication is set up. So we're going to use a web page to get their permission, to get their authorization to access it. From the result of that web page, we will get their access token and their refresh token. How many of you are familiar with OAuth and doing the OAuth stuff with Google? Okay, so basically we'll be doing that sort of stuff the exact same way we do it now, using web tools that we already have. We'll save that, store those credentials against something we have in their account profile, usually either their email address or their Google ID. And then when they call our action, we'll be able to figure out what their Google user ID is, or their email is, pull up their credentials, and use those credentials as part of any web APIs that we need to do. A couple of extra steps, but all fairly straightforward, and if you've done OAuth, it's stuff you should be fairly familiar with already. The biggest difference is that on the assistant side, we need to use a special part of Google Sign-In called Google Sign-In for the assistant. Other than that, pretty straightforward. Hey, Google, advance.
Okay.
Advance.
So they need to authorize us through a website and then authenticate through voice. What do you need to do in your action?
Pretty much that's it. So on our action side, first and foremost, we need to make sure we return a promise. So our handler down at the bottom, we're going to make sure we return the promise there. But then inside that, we need to get the user ID and profile information from the conversation object. And that's the first 3 lines that we, the second and third line there. We get the payload and we get their ID. Then we need, based on this ID, we need to get their credentials from a database. And then we need to do something with those credentials, like access a file, save a file with color information, who knows what. But you'll notice I didn't actually show you the code for those 2 parts. And the reason why is because they have nothing whatsoever to do with the assistant. Those are the sorts of things that you should already know how to do, or you learn how to do them, but they have nothing to do with the assistant. The first one, pull it out of Firebase, pull it out of a database somehow. These are things as developers we know how to do. The second one is accessing Google's Drive API. Again, if we're familiar with the Drive API, we already know how to do it. Otherwise, lots and lots of documentation. But what I hope you see here is pretty much the part that's assistant related itself is just a few lines, and then we're doing stuff that we already know how to do. And that's what's wonderful about the assistant, is that you already know how to do most of the things that you want to do. Hey, Google, advance.
It sounds like writing an action is just like writing other apps or websites.
Well, it is. It's close. But there are a lot of things that we have to keep in mind that are different than what we're used to when we've done web development or when we've done app development. So we need to remember that human conversations have context. And people, when we're talking to each other, we kind of assume that. I mean, in that sentence itself, that. What does that refer to? Well, it refers to the context. As humans, when we talk, we understand this. We need to make sure that the systems that we build also understand this kind of context. We need to reply in ways that don't sound robotic, and that includes varying our responses. So sometimes if we were talking about colors, I might say, yeah, my favorite color is blue as well. And sometimes I'll say, that's also my favorite color, or that's also a pretty cool color. Varying responses is an important part of how humans communicate with each other. We use different phrases from moment to moment. And it's very different than a graphical user interface where we expect to see the exact same thing every time. Because if we don't, we get this cue that something is wrong. When we're talking, We don't get that cue when something differs. In fact, we feel very uncomfortable if it repeats the same thing over and over. Because repeating the same thing over and over sounds really weird if you repeat the same thing over and over. Intents represent what the user is trying to convey. And I say that again because so many people don't get this. There are many different ways that a user can say the same sorts of things. So with our color example, they could say, I like blue. Blue is cool. Blue is pretty rad. My favorite color is blue.
This audience isn't responding right now. Try again soon.
And then finally, we've got some new twists when we need to internationalize things. So don't just take your phrases and throw them into Google Translate and expect that to work, because your international audience will go, what are they saying? I mean, I sort of get it, but nobody talks that way. They're not going to take you seriously. So unlike visual translations, where people will think it's a little weird, but they can muddle along, when they're listening and when they're speaking to you, if the language really doesn't hit it right on the nose, it's just not going to feel right. And when it doesn't feel right, they're not going to want to work with you. Hey, Google, advance.
Sounds like the code to handle that can get complicated.
It can be, but we're doing better and better at it. We're getting more and more tools. It's still a fairly young technology. And we've got libraries like Multivocal, which try to make things a little bit easier. So it reduces the boilerplate. So instead of a lot of code just to get things going, you can focus on exactly what it is you want to reply with, exactly how you get your data out, because your data is actually the interesting part of your coding, not the formatting the reply and selecting which reply to use. Your code will need to implement the logic and generate values that are unique to your action. And then you're going to have configuration and templates that deal with the rest of it. So you might template out a bunch of different responses and let the system figure out which one to use. Similarly, when it comes to internationalization, you can hand off this entire package of templates to somebody else, and they'll translate it. And then you're just sticking in values where the values are important. Hey, Google, advance.
Can you show an example about how it is easier?
So here's the same response from the first one. It just takes the color in, gives the response back. But there are a couple of differences here. The first is that it's internationalized. So instead of just responding in English, it now determines if you are from the US and you're speaking the US flavor of English, or you're speaking the English that they speak in the rest of the world. And there are some slight variances between the two phrases that we use. It's also has broken out the fact that we will respond to something, and then our prompt for the next thing is separate, because we may prompt for the next thing the same way across a bunch of intents, but our response for this intent is very particular. We're going to pull out just the color part of the response and send that back. The other thing you'll notice is there's no code here. This is all configuration. The reason why there's no code here is because we didn't need to do anything with the color. If we needed to make an API call, then all we would need to do is make the API call with the color and store the result in the environment, and then make sure our templates use that result somewhere. So all of our logic, all of our processing gets isolated into a function, while all of our replies, how we're talking to the user, gets put into the configuration and templates. The other nice part about this is that since it's configuration, you can put this configuration anywhere. You can put it in a database and change it dynamically if you need to. Hey, Google, advance.
If they've been ignoring you for the past 20 minutes, what should they make sure they know now?
I think the most important thing that I really hope you take away from the whole thing is most of what you need to know to develop an action, you already know it. And that's because you're developers and you know how to develop and connect different pieces together. The big difference with the assistant is it's one more piece that has a very, very different user interface to it. That's the big part that you need to think about, is that interface, how you write it, how you connect it up to the data that you already have. So you need to create that personality first, and then write scripts around that personality. When you're writing your scripts, remember, People talk differently than they write. When you're actually acting out the scripts, have it you and a person next to you act them out. Hear what they sound like, see what they feel like. You're going to change them after that, almost guaranteed. Remember that intent is what a user says and they do, not how you respond to what they say and do. When you're dealing with JavaScript and with other languages, make sure you use promises correctly, because that's really the biggest problem that we're seeing with a lot of users right now. And then finally, don't mix your logic and your response. Have very clear parts of your code where you're taking the input, generating the basic nuggets of what the output is going to be, and have a separate part of your code, or better with multivocal, that separate part in your configuration actually be the part that determines what is said based on the inputs, based on what you've computed. Remember, it is kind of fun to do the impossible. We're developers, we can do that. Hey Google, advance.
I hope everyone now realizes that if they can dream it, they can do it with the assistant. And this all sounds really exciting, but I see Figment is here and waving to me. Besides, you've probably been talking too long. Where can they learn more?
So again, up at the top, the URLs where you'll be able to find me. Prisoner.com also has all of my social links and where you can find the various things that I publish. Down at the bottom, bunch of important links. This is the second slide, by the way, you can take a picture of. A bunch of links for more information about the assistant itself. The first one is from Google. This is almost a book about designing voice agents. There's a lot to learn. It's very dense, but you can just begin it and skim it and take in more as you go along. Second is how to actually build an action. What does it take? What's the code required? How do you fit the pieces together to the pieces that you already know? When you encounter problems, that's going to be a when, not an if. You're going to turn to Stack Overflow. When you do turn to Stack Overflow, post under the tag actions on Google. We've got a very big community there that is really, really willing to help you and wants to help you create great stuff. And then finally, if you're interested in more about multivocal, that's the URL for multivocal at the bottom. Any questions? Uh-oh.
So you said before, intent is what a user says and not how the app...
Not how we process it.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on that? Like what could be an example of how you might do that wrong?
Sure. Actually, I've written a whole article on it. So if you go to my Medium page, A. Firstenberg at Medium.
This audience isn't responding right now. Try again soon.
Give it up. I've got 3 whole articles discussing this. But in short, it's things like when a user answers yes, they're saying yes. What do you do with that? What does that mean? Are they saying yes, they want to continue? Are they saying yes, they'd like a salami sandwich? Are they saying yes, cancel the order? The context is what we as developers need to impose on that. All the user is saying is yes, and that's their intent. Now, sometimes we can use the same phrases for different intents, and we have ways to distinguish that. The example I think I give there is there are times when it's prompting whether you want to learn more about a letter or a number. And at any point in the conversation, they can change over to the other one just by saying, well, give me a number now. Now, how I react to that, I might say, what, you don't want to hear any more about my letters? Or I might just give them the answer. So how I react to something is totally, I won't say it's independent of what they say, but it is independent of which intent gets triggered. It's very dependent on what they say. But I don't necessarily have a single function that is triggered by a single intent. There are a bunch of different chains of logic that I might follow based on what they've just told me. Did that does that make sense? I see a couple of people nodding and a couple of people nodding off. Okay. Any other questions? It's late in the afternoon. I understand nodding off. Any other questions? Well, I would like to thank you all. Go ahead, yeah. Oh, microphone, right.
Why does the assistant keep interrupting your talk?
Why does the assistant keep interrupting my talk? Okay, because the way I taught it to advance slides is it advances a slide and then waits 1 minute and 40 seconds. And what's supposed to happen is that after 1 minute and 40 seconds, if I haven't told it to continue, it waits another 1 minute and 40 seconds. Somehow there is a bug in there that crept in within the last 2 days since I tested this last, such that after 1 minute and 40 seconds, it concludes that I'm not going to say anything else, so it gives up on the conversation. So I just need to restart the conversation. And fortunately, I developed the slide changing app in such a way that I can restart the conversation in the middle of the deck of slides. But that's the short reason why it bails out after 1 minute and 40 seconds. It does, however, help me keep the slides moving quickly, so I don't linger too long on a single slide. So in some ways that's a good thing, but that wasn't the intent. Anything else? Well, I will be around the rest of the day. My contact information is up there. I am also on Stack Overflow. So if you do have further questions, please get a hold of me. And I really encourage you, take a look at Actions on Google. I think you'll find it far easier to work with than you thought. Thanks very much, everyone.